And then is anyone unmuted? Because I hear an echo.
We can make sure everyone's
I'm going to mute. It was me. I was typing.
Okay, well, welcome to Future Focus Friday for Friday, July 17th, 2020. Today's topic is interviewing basics, and our presenter today is Allison Smolinski, a senior career advisor in career exploration and development. And I will turn it over to you, Allison.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Glad to have you with us today. As Julie said, my name is Allison Smolinski. I'm one of our senior career advisors, and we are going to go through interviewing basics today. So we're going to start with our traditional 30-minute presentation, followed by some more informal breakout rooms. So if you do have questions throughout the presentation, feel free to use the raise your hand feature or type a question in the chat. I also hope that you will participate throughout. We do have a couple questions that we're going to open up to the group throughout the presentation today, but we'll just have you put all your answers to those questions right in the chat since they're going to be pretty brief. But we'd like to see your participation there to gauge where you're at and what your thoughts are on some of these interviewing elements. So to start us off, we are going to start with a question, and I'd like to know what makes you most what makes you most nervous when you're interviewing? So we'll give you a couple seconds to type in some answers in the chat. Okay, we've got some coming in, being nervous about talking too much or too fast, stumbling over words. Yeah, absolutely. Not looking the part. Yeah, these are great. Thank you all for sharing. So you covered a lot of what common fears are when it comes to interviewing. We've got some examples up here. And it's very common and normal to be a little bit stressed or nervous leading up to an interview. That is absolutely normal. A little bit of anxiety about that is okay. But the best way to combat that fear and anxiety is practice and preparation. The more you practice, the more you prep, the more confident you'll feel going into your interview. And we want to help you with that practice and preparation today, going through what some of those practices are that you can do so that you alleviate some of that worry or fear going into your next interview. So the first thing I want to go over is the various types of interviews. So I've got 4 up on the screen right now. And while most of us might think that companies just interview you once and that's done, that is not always the case. Some employers might only have 1 round of interviews for candidates, but others might have candidates go through multiple rounds of interviews and maybe eliminate a few candidates each time or each round. So that's where these preliminary screening and follow-up interviews come into play, those first 2 options on the screen. The preliminary screening might be an early round where employers are just trying to get a baseline of your skills and whether or not you might be a good fit. But then there might be more interviews down the line where you meet with more members of the team and you're asked more advanced or serious questions about the role. The number of interviews that you go through might change from when you first start the interviewing process to the end. This can be really common especially if employers might be down to the final 2 candidates, but they're really not sure who to go with. Right now, the candidates are tied, so to speak. So they might be at that final decision-making process, but be unable to come to a decision. So they might call those final 2 candidates back for another interview, even if they've already been through a couple interviews already, just to really try to get some tie-breaking answers from those candidates and determine who's going to be the best fit. There are also group interviews and panel interviews. So again, I think sometimes we commonly perceive that interviews are one-on-one. just the candidate and the employer, but that is not always the case. There could be situations where multiple candidates are being interviewed at the same time. I don't know about you all, that feels a little bit weird to me. Like, why would I be there with my competition? But in some circumstances, an employer might be planning to hire multiple candidates or a group of people to work in the same department or in similar roles. And a situation like group interviews allows the employer to observe how those candidates work together, how I think that my microphone cut out there for a moment. Am I back?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. So we were talking about group interviews, and employers might be using those to see how candidates work together and communicate on a team, because it could be likely that they're going to hire candidates, maybe 2 or 3, that demonstrate during a group interview that they will work really well together. A panel interview, on the other hand, is likely just one candidate, but you might be sitting in a room with 5, 6, maybe even 7 employees at the company that you're interviewing with. What this does is give the employer a chance to possibly have employees from many different departments, different levels of employment in the company, all share their opinions and thoughts on a particular candidate. So they can get a very diverse spread of opinions on a candidate and make an informed decision. So don't be caught off guard if you see lots of these different types of interviews or experience some of these situations throughout your own interview process, because interviews can look like a lot of different things. There's 2 more interview types, phone interviews and virtual interviews, but those are things that we're going to talk about in one of our breakout sessions today. So we're not going to dive too deep into them here, but just do be prepared to practice and prepare specifically for phone and virtual interviews right now, because with the pandemic still continuing and some employees still working from home at lots of companies, if companies are at a point where they're ready to hire, they might want to do all of their recruiting and interviewing exclusively over the computer or over the phone. So keep that in mind and recognize that that might be something that comes up for you, especially in these next couple weeks and months. So preparation is key. Preparation is the first step to a successful interview, no matter what type or what method you go through. So ways to prepare are, first, to know the job description in and out. You really want to have that committed to memory so that you can talk about the top skills that you have that you know that that employer is looking for. The job description is a great way to start identifying what are some of your own key skills and abilities that are really going to stand out to this employer. They've probably put those as qualifications or wish list items in their job description, so be very, very familiar with that document. You also want to do thorough and extensive research on the company before your interview. Know what their organization does, some of their most successful projects or efforts, know what their mission and vision are for the future. All of this will help you answer your interview questions with the company in mind and show that you've done diligent preparation for the interview. You also want to have done some research on the industry and on your field in general, and understand how that might be impacting the company that you're interviewing with specifically. Know what is challenging to the industry right now, but maybe also be aware of some exciting or new innovation or technology that's really changing the game for your field or industry of interest. That's going to be able to allow you to have an intelligent dialogue about trends in your field and really show that employer that you're prepared and invested in your career long term. And last thing to prepare is just practice, practice, practice. The more you challenge yourself, the more confident and prepared you will feel for the real thing. So we have some practice resources on the screen for you here. One of them is called Interview Stream, and the other one is an appointment with any of us. So if you want to practice on your own time in maybe a safe space alone in your room, nobody can see or hear you, that's sometimes a good way to start, especially if you're very nervous or unsure about how you'll perform. Interview Stream is a really great resource for that. It's also a great resource because if you are going to have a virtual interview coming up, it's the most realistic way for you to gauge what your background looks like. Does your technology sort of work up to speed for a virtual interview, and will everything work correctly?
Allison, your sound cut out again.
Which is very ironic as I lose power to my headset again. We've plugged in, so we should be good for the rest of this presentation. So with that in mind, it allows you to practice with your technology, and you can practice on your own time. It's great because you are able to choose from a preset list of questions that you can practice in Interview Stream, but you're also able to set your own list of questions if there's a specific group of questions that you know you want to practice. Once you run through a practice interview where it records your answers, you can play them back for yourself and start to even self-assess. What do I do well and what do I still need to practice? So it's a really great tool for that. The other tool, like we said, is scheduling an appointment with any one of our career advisors. This is great because we are able to give you some feedback on your performance, both things that you already do really well and things you might want to continue practicing in real time. So I've circled on the screen the different web addresses that you can go to seek out either of these resources, and we'll share them at the end of the presentation as well. So now we're going to move on to general tips for your interview. And we've broken it into 3 different terms: before, during, and after your interview, with recommendations for each stage. So before, you want to, even if it's a virtual interview, you want to set out a nice outfit, have multiple copies of your resume, and make sure you know where you're going and when you need to be there. You always want to be early for an interview. You don't want to be late. You don't want to get lost. And for something virtual or on the phone, you don't want to find out that you have the wrong phone number or the link to your interview doesn't work until that interview already should have started. During the interview, we're going to go over a lot of tips and tricks for how to ace that interview and how to make the best impression right there in the moment. So I won't dive too far into the during period right now, but the biggest thing I want to share right here is just remembering to relax, 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 and be yourself. Being your true authentic self and trying to stay calm throughout that process is 50% of the battle. The rest is being able to answer questions, which we will go over in the rest of this presentation. Afterwards, always say thank you and make sure to follow up again once you're home or once that interview is over. Handwritten thank yous are great, and emails can be acceptable as well if a handwritten thank you card isn't quite feasible for the situation that you're in. Keeping track of who you talked to throughout the interview is also important so that you know exactly who you worked with and you can thank them personally, as well as maybe put a specific tidbit or callback to a specific thing that you talked about in your conversation with that person. All of that looks really good and shows that you were paying very good attention during your interview and had some great takeaways from your conversation. So let's come back to the during part of an interview. We're going to go kind of step by step on how that interview is going to look day of. Each format is obviously going to vary slightly depending on how long your process is and how many people you might meet with, but most of your interview conversations are genuinely going to follow this structure. So first, you show up and both of you are making a first impression. You're starting to get to know each other. You're taking in how that person maybe shakes your hand, or do they maintain eye contact? Are they friendly? And they're assessing all those same things about you. So fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, it is a really, really important part of the process, because you can see our quote at the top there. Hiring managers do start to make a decision about you very early on in the interview, sometimes within that first 10 minutes. So first impressions are key. You want to make sure you're making a good one. The bulk of that time together then during the interview is the employer's questions for you. They're going to be assessing, do you have the skills? Are you a good culture fit for our company? Do you want to be here? Are you the candidate who wants to work for us the most, etc. We'll go over specifically what some of the questions are that they will ask you, but that is definitely the bulk portion of any interview that you go through. Next will be your questions. You want to make sure that you are always showing up to an interview with questions for the employer as well. Really, interviews, the more they look like a conversation, usually that means the better they're going. So if you have a lot of conversations and questions that will spark that further dialogue, that looks really good to the employer. But also, it's important that you do get your questions answered so that if you do ultimately get an offer for that position, you have all the information you need to make the best and informed decision for you as to whether accept or pass on that opportunity. And then finally, there's closing and final follow-up. So each party might ask their final questions and say their goodbyes. During this part, you definitely want to make sure, if you didn't ask during your question point, to clarify what the next steps are. You're going to want to know if there's going to be another round of interviews, how long it will be till you be notified of a decision, etc. Don't leave that room or that phone call not knowing what the next steps will be in that process. But once you've identified that, then you go your separate ways and send thank yous. So thinking about specific types of questions and questions that you might have been asked in previous interviews, what questions do you struggle with the most? Go ahead and put your answers in the chat again so we can see some examples. Okay, we've got one that asks about your 5 or 10-year goals. Absolutely. What are your strengths and weaknesses? Yeah. Even just those two are some that we specifically highlighted, but we also have some additional entries. Tell me about yourself. Why should we hire you? Absolutely. You guys are hitting on lots of the most challenging ones that we often hear from students. You know, I didn't know how to answer that. I don't know how to answer that. That question makes me nervous. So that's what we're going to go over next. We're going to pose some of the most challenging questions that we hear, or most common questions that we hear, as well as some tips to answer them, and then some additional examples that you might come across in each category. So our first category of interview questions that we're going to cover is qualifications and background. You can see someone put in the chat, tell me about yourself, was one of the hardest questions or most challenging questions that you faced before. And you can see it's the very first one that we put in our examples here. So some tips for answering that age-old question, tell me about yourself. This is a very broad question, and many candidates struggle knowing how to answer it. So our biggest tips are to keep your answer limited to your academic and professional accomplishments. Some candidates think this is the place to tell them that you really enjoy boating as a hobby, or art, and your favorite TV shows. And those aren't necessarily always bad things to include. However, it's more important to keep this answer strictly professional, strictly academic, and strictly covering your skills as they relate to this specific position. Always make sure that whatever it is that you're interviewing for, you know that job description in and out, and therefore have an idea of what skills and qualifications you possess that are going to be most applicable to this exact position. One of the ones you put in the chat as well is, what is your biggest weakness? Or the strengths and weaknesses question. Usually people feel pretty confident talking about their strengths, but then they get to weaknesses and they aren't sure where to start. For this one, you want to have a weakness. That is a question that I get a lot. Well, can I tell them I don't have any weaknesses? Or what if I can't think of one? We all have them. That's not a bad thing to admit. In fact, being able to comment on some of your own shortcomings shows a lot of self-awareness that employers usually want to see in their own employees. So do have something to talk about. Do be able to share a weakness. But at the same time, you don't want that weakness to be an essential task for the job at hand. If that task is all about customer service and you say your biggest weakness is communicating with people and providing customer service, that's probably not going to be a good fit for either of you then. So you don't want to necessarily talk about a weakness that is significantly going to detract from your ability to do that job well. In whatever weakness you do choose to talk about, let it be honest, and also talk about what you're doing to improve on that skill. Another thing you want to avoid in answering this is saying, here's this weakness I have. Hope you can deal with it, employer. Instead, you want to say, I do have this weakness. I've recognized I've had this shortcoming. However, since I am aware of it, here are the steps that I am taking to improve on that weakness or compensate for that weakness so that I can still work effectively in my position and with others. That's the strongest way that you can answer that question, and it's definitely a tricky one and takes some practice. Some other possible question examples that an employer might ask you relating to qualifications and background: why are you interested in working in this field? What motivates you? What strengths do you have and how do they relate to this position? And where do you see yourself in 5 to 10 years? So you could see a handful of these, and a lot of our tips listed here are going to be applicable to these other questions too. Our next question category are questions about the specific organization and specific position. So one of our commonly challenging questions in this category is, why did you apply for this position? So for individuals who struggle answering that question, our tips are to be sure to tie in your qualifications with their organization's purpose, mission, and what they're looking for in a candidate. This is a question where your company research really comes in handy. You want to be also kind of answering in this question, why is that company exciting to you? Why would you be happy to work there? By even answering those secondary questions, you're ultimately answering why you applied and why you think this is a great opportunity for you and a good fit for both parties. Some other possible questions you might be asked in this category are, how will you ensure your skills and knowledge are current throughout your career? What do you know about our organization? What do you believe will be the most challenging part of this role? And how do your personal values and characteristics align with our company? With these, there are often no wrong answers, but again, a lot of them tie into that company research. So you want to make sure you've done that research ahead of time so that you have an answer for these questions. And then whatever you choose to talk about in your answer, there is no wrong way to go about it. You just need to be honest and authentic to what excites and inspires you about this position, what you do think is challenging, and then the employer will weigh that against what they're looking for. Our next category type is work style and values. So some challenging questions we see within this category is, do you prefer to work independently or in a team? And how do you organize your schedule and tasks? Those are some that we find challenging. And for all of these questions, much like I said last time, the most important thing is to be honest. But particularly for work style and value type questions, I frequently hear from students that they think about, well, what can I say that will sound good? Or what can I say that the employer wants to hear? That's the wrong way to go about these questions. The more important piece is to truly be honest to yourself and to your process, because even if at the end of the day you give an answer that the employer doesn't like and that's the reason that they don't hire you, if that answer that you gave is consistent with your work style and your values, that means it's probably good that you didn't get that position, because it's likely then that that would have been a point of conflict or contention if you did get that job and found out later that your work style didn't really mesh with what the company was looking for. So don't be afraid to be honest. Give examples for why your preferences are what they are, or examples of where you've been successful in a certain style or value that you uphold. And then again, it's really up to the employer to take and assess how that fits with their company. Some other examples of these types of questions might be, what is the greatest challenge you faced and how did you handle it? How do you handle stress? What is most important to you in your job? What was the most enjoyable part of your undergraduate program? And how do you practice self-care? Our final question category is behavioral-based questions. So these are the types of questions that you might have heard that start with phrases like, tell me about a time when, or describe a situation when, what would you do in this situation, or give me an example of. The reason that employers ask these questions is because research does show us that past behavior is frequently indicative of future behavior. So if you could demonstrate actions that you've taken previously, the employer can then assume that you will likely take those actions again, for better or worse. So for these answers, it is incredibly important to use a specific example. Lots of people answer these questions with generalizations or hypotheticals, but the more specific and singular you are when you answer these questions, the better. To practice starting to give specific examples, we recommend answering all behavioral type questions with the STAR method, which we'll dive a little bit deeper into in the moment. But in the meantime, I want to give you some examples of what these specific behavioral-based questions might look like. So we have, describe a time you were facing a situation that was beyond your training and abilities. How would you handle a situation where you disagreed with a colleague or supervisor? Describe some of your most recent frustrations. How did you handle those? Give me an example of a time when you used good judgment and logic to solve a problem. Tell me about a time when you failed. By examples, convince me that you can adapt to a wide variety of people, situations, and environments. And tell me about a time when you had to work with a customer that you didn't like. So these are a really diverse set of questions that can be really indicative of how those specific examples will help you answer each of these. So again, to do that is helpful by using the STAR method or the STARK method. We have K in parentheses there, and we'll describe what that means in a minute. So STAR stands for situation, task, action, result, and then our K is knowledge. So each of these represent a different part of how you would answer the question with a specific example. So let's start with situation. The first thing you want to do in your answer is set the stage for us. Describe what the situation was when you demonstrated certain skill or qualification that you're describing to the employer. So employers want to know what happened, but they don't necessarily need a really long-winded backstory. So you want to keep the situation part of your answer as brief and concise as possible, because it's not the most important thing that you need to talk about. Just stick to the basic information that they absolutely need to know in order to understand the context of the situation that you're describing. For the T, which is task, you are describing what was the task at hand, or what needed to happen. What goal were you working towards to resolve whatever problem or situation you were in? It sort of goes hand in hand with situation. Then A is the actions that you specifically took. A is one of the most important pieces because you really want the example that you choose to talk about to reflect you and what you contributed. So even if you use a group project and you talk about maybe a class project that you did where 4 or 5 of you were working on the same goal or the same project, you might describe the group and the situation and the task, but for action, you only want to be talking about what you did. What were your specific contributions to that group project that might have made it successful or really show what you contributed to the greater group. Then you want to move on to the result. What happened? How did that situation end? What were the results? Did it help? Did it make it worse? How did that situation or task wrap up in the end? And that's where knowledge comes in too. I speak frequently with students who I'm using the group project example still, they might want to use a group project as their answer to a question, but they're like, well, what if we didn't get a good grade? Or what if we were all arguing and fighting and it was actually a very negative group work experience? Well, that's not necessarily a bad example to use if you can wrap in this K and this knowledge component, because one of the most important pieces of going through a situation and coming out on the other end is being able to describe what did you learn from that situation. And particularly if the result was negative or didn't reach the goal that you were hoping for, knowledge can then include what would you do differently now that you have been through that situation, seen the outcome, and still want to improve on it. What would you do instead? So that's what the knowledge piece represents, is how would you use the knowledge that you gained from this example and apply it to future situations to do better. So let's go ahead and look at an example and see the STAR or STARK method in action. And we're going to use the example, tell me about a time when you used creativity and logic to solve a problem. So we've got our question up here at the top. And let's start with our S, our situation. When my organization had to send all their employees home due to a pandemic, sound familiar? I was unable to complete my regular duties in the way that I had been previously. That's our situation. Very sweet, very simple, to the point, but helps the employer understand what was the context of what was going on. So now let's dive into task. I had to figure out how to continue to share resources with and provide support for students in a virtual environment. Okay, that was the task at hand. So now for action, I quickly learned a new technology that enabled me to host virtual meetings with students. I also created brief video tutorials and interactive digital handouts to continue to help students to develop in their career goals. Those are the action steps that this person personally took to make sure their goal was reached. Now, results. What happened? Students were able to utilize our services and resources at a higher frequency, and we were able to serve students who were previously unable to engage with us in person. So this is a positive result because we're seeing that not only was the goal met, but we were able to provide additional services and go above and beyond than what we intended to by going through these steps and taking the action that we did. But we still want to incorporate knowledge because in this part, we say, this experience challenged me to further develop my flexibility and adaptability skills. So it's also highlighting an additional set of skills than what we included in the action part, like learning a new technology, creating video tutorials, but also highlights some transferable skills like flexibility and adaptability to achieve that goal. So this is a step-by-step example of what you might share with an employer to answer the question above. So now you all can try it out, and we're not going to take time here and now, but I do want to share a resource with you all that is an interactive one-pager to help you take your experiences and translate them into the STAR or STARK method. So one of my colleagues is going to go ahead and drop a link to this handout in the chat that all of you can download and use for your own practice. So at the very end of your interview, while the employer is asking you questions, they will likely throw out what we call the final question. And it's a little bit daunting because frequently it is phrased something like, "Why should I hire you?" or "Why are you the best candidate?" These questions almost always stump students, especially you humble ones who might not be as comfortable bragging on yourself or who are genuinely questioning yourself whether you're truly the best fit for that job. Do not let this question scare you or throw you off your guard. Truly, it's just a way for you to summarize everything that you've already shared in the interview. Or particularly if there's a skill or a qualification that you have that the employer hasn't asked you about yet, this is a great way to insert that extra tidbit of information to say, well, actually, I haven't had a chance to talk about this really cool project that I did or this really great skill that I have. So let me go ahead and share that with you because I think that really makes me unique and sets me apart from probably the other candidates that you're interviewing. So don't be afraid of this question. You can also approach it as the same way as your elevator pitch in a more condensed version. Your elevator pitch really focuses on what are the things that you are best at and what really sets you apart as a candidate. And then in this form, all you do is relate it back to a specific job. So really, there's rarely brand new information that you're sharing here, even though sometimes the question is phrased that way, which is ultimately what throws candidates off guard. Well, what haven't I told you already? It's okay if you've already talked about everything. Just re-summarize and really give them a power statement for why all of the qualifications and examples that you've already provided truly set you apart and make you the best fit. So now let's summarize with questions to ask the interviewer. This is our very last step, and it's the last thing that we're going to cover in our presentation here today. You always, as we said at the beginning, want to bring questions with you and have questions ready to ask. Again, we recommend 8 to 10, which might feel like a lot, but it's very common that just through natural conversation or an introduction, or maybe if you get a tour of the office, that the employer is going to answer a lot of the questions you have just organically without you having to ask them. So you'd never want to find yourself in a situation where you only came with 4 questions, they answered them all already, ask you what questions you have, and you say you don't have any questions. Having questions and having intelligent and well-researched questions to ask really, again, show the employer that you are invested in this opportunity and you're invested in their company. So these questions are great to have because of how they show you to the employer, but also, again, you want to make sure that these are questions you genuinely want to know the answers to. Again, an interview really is a two-way street, and while you want to be there to impress the employer, you also want to make sure that they're a good fit for you and that you will fit in and feel comfortable in their culture, in their organizational environment, get along with the people who work there. So the more questions you can ask to get an idea of what that culture and that fit and those day-to-day responsibilities really look like will help you make an informed decision for yourself down the line. So we have a couple example questions that you might ask up here. But again, if you feel like you already know the answer to one of these or it's not as important to you, don't ask it just for the sake of asking it. Come up with a different set of questions that are meaningful to you. So we have, how did this position become available? How is the orientation and training structured, or how much training will there be? What are you looking for in a candidate? What do you like about working here? How will my performance be evaluated? What are some of the biggest challenges that this organization faces? And what is the next step in the selection process? So that is all we have for you on some general interviewing basics here. I went through, a couple resources earlier in the presentation that I want to reiterate here on this slide so that you have the links to Interview Stream, our website to go ahead and schedule advising appointments, as well as to a direct link to one of our web pages that covers a lot of these interviewing tips and tricks that we talked about today. So take a moment to take a look at these, copy down any of those URLs that are helpful to you, and then we will move on to breakout rooms. This is also our contact information. So I have our office location and our office contacts up here. You also have my name. Again, my name is Allison Smolinski. I'm one of our advisors. And also Michelle Adkins and Krithika Graw are listed here because they are going to take over our breakout sessions now for the rest of our time together today. So do jot their names down too if any of us can help you moving forward in this process. So without further ado then, we will go ahead and move into breakout sessions, and Krithika is going to spearhead our virtual interviewing while Michelle goes over interview etiquette. So we'll go ahead and help you get into various rooms, and thank you all so much for spending this time with us.
Thank you, Allison. And we will also make this recording available through Handshake, so you have access to it after the presentation and can follow up if you'd like any more information that was listed in the presentation.